This is Iran in the 1970s. People there are dancing the twist, listening to rock and roll, and wearing miniskirts. And this isn't just any woman with a cigarette, it's the Shah's wife. The smiling man with the lighter is the Shah himself. But in modern Iran, the country's leader looks quite different. Women don't wear bright miniskirts, but rather classic Muslim attire. And now they don't practice Western dancing or singing, but sometimes, like this, shooting. Iran's former supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has been killed. The US and Israel have launched Operation Epic Fury. After decades of a regional Cold War, Israel is reducing its sworn enemy to ruins, and the US is so confident in its strength that Donald Trump has already declared victory. How did a country that was on the path to westernization and Americanization spiral into a harsh Islamic republic? How did Iran suddenly go from being an ally of everyone, the US, Britain, and the USSR, to becoming a pariah state? Why are there anti-government protests in Iran time and again? First, let's compare these two astonishing figures. Nearly 99% in both cases. What's going on here? Look, in 1963, the Iranian authorities held a referendum and asked their people a simple question. Do you support our visionary reforms? We're going to fight illiteracy and provide free primary education for everyone. Farmers will be able to buy land from landlords, and we'll deal with the feudal past that's holding Iran back from developing. We'll give women a whole bunch of rights, including the right to vote. And of course, we'll develop modern industries. Yes, and most importantly, we'll march toward a bright Western future with our allies from the US and the UK. What do Iranians say? 99.9% confidently reply, yes, we do. Now let's fast forward 16 years. Iranian cities look like this. Crowds of protesters are smashing government buildings, burning portraits of the Shah, calling for his death, and literally praying to their Islamic spiritual leader, who has been exiled from the country for 14 years but supports the revolution. And in the end, the Islamic Revolution triumphs and the Shah flees. And in 1979, another referendum raises different questions. Do you want a real, honest Islamic republic instead of all this pro-American nonsense with women in miniskirts? 99.3% of voters say yes. On the one hand, it seems that for the past 16 years, Iranian society has been following a strict pro-Western path, has become disillusioned with it, and now wants something of its own, something traditionally Iranian. Does that make sense? It does, but not entirely. In 1963, Iran's population was approximately 23 million, and only 5.5 million vote for pro-Western reforms. That is, less than a quarter of all Iranians. But the government claims that 99% support us. Convincing? You bet. And by 1979, Iran's population had grown to 37 million. More than half the country's residents, 20 million people, vote for the Islamic Republic. But the authorities again use the more convincing figure of 99% and change. See what I mean? Yes. In fact, both sides want to rely solely on their loyal audience. They don't care about the interests of the rest. But how did Iran first end up in the embrace of the collective West and then become an outcast under sanctions? Iran, or Persia in the past, is a state that until 1979, for 2,500 years, was a continuous monarchy. That is, it is obvious that any traditions there will be stronger than any innovations. The last Shah came to power in 1941, at the very moment when Iran was occupied by Soviet and British troops. Why did they do that? First, the Allied powers, and at that time the war against Germany was underway, needed strategic oil reserves, and Iran has plenty of it. To give you an idea, there is 2.5 times more oil there today than in Russia or the United Arab Emirates, and 4 times more than in the United States. Iran ranks third in the world, behind only Saudi Arabia and Venezuela. Second reason, the country has a very advantageous geographical location. During World War II, the Soviet Union received a third of all its lend-lease. That is, military and humanitarian aid from the US via this trans-Iranian railway. And you've probably heard that it was in Tehran in 1943 that the historic meeting of the anti-Hitler allies, Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt, took place. But to be honest, people in Tehran itself don't like to remember this meeting. Why? Because, let me remind you, the country was occupied by these very allies. When World War II ends, both British and Soviet troops will, of course, withdraw from Iran, but no one will abandon their appetite for Iranian oil. Here's an interesting example. As soon as a local prime minister decides to nationalize, that is, to return to Iran what rightfully belongs to Iran, namely the country's largest oil company, what do the Americans and the British do? That's right. They send in their agents of influence, and the disobedient prime minister's government is overthrown, and the oil company is ultimately divided up among BP, Shell, the big five American companies, and a tiny bit goes to the French. And what does Iran get? A 25-year contract and 50% of the net profits. Someone might say, well, that's not so bad, is it? And I'll reply that the oil is Iranian, but the brazen guys from across the border come to pump it on their own terms. Oh yes, to ensure that no more local prime ministers with creative ideas about taking Iran's oil back for Iran ever appear, the British and Americans are betting on the Shah. He doesn't really speak up during the occupation. Well, let them rule, and if the local Iranian parliament gets in his way, let him dissolve it. The main thing is that the favorable terms hold. Oil for the West, money and a little technology for Iran, and palaces for the Shah. And on the one hand, what's so bad about that? With oil money, the Shah begins to reform Iran in earnest. Just look at Tehran in the 1970s. Even back then, it was called the Paris of the East. Look at all the foreign cars on the streets, models that were cutting edge at the time. Here, for example, a Volkswagen Beetle is driving by. There's a Soviet Gaz Volga. It's kind of like a Ford, right? And here are two more Beetles. How stylish and charming the shop windows look. People in bright clothes, fashion magazines with Iranian beauties on the covers. Women teach in schools and pass laws in local parliaments. Hundreds of thousands of Iranians are studying at Western universities. But in reality, not everyone benefits from these capital city transformations. In the mid-20th century, Iran was a backwater agrarian nation with a level of technological development at or below average. The Shah, as I said, understood this and began reforms. On the one hand, new technology appeared in the villages and labor productivity increased, but on the other hand, there was simply no longer a need for so many farmers in rural areas now that there were tractors and combine harvesters. What's the result? Millions of poor Iranians are flocking to the cities in search of a better life. Of course, factories and plants are being built there. For example, joint ventures with the French automotive industry such as Peugeot, Renault, and Citroën, but there is no massive acceleration of development, as there was in the Soviet Union or later in China. As a result, Tehran itself begins to be overrun by slums. Most of the newcomers have no jobs, no decent housing, no money, and no entertainment. Instead, they are easily swayed by the radical ideas of the preachers. The poor began to protest and demanded the overthrow of the reformist Shah and his Western lifestyle, which they saw but could not attain for themselves. How did the Shah respond? In 1971, he decided to celebrate the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire in grand style. The Shah decided to hold the celebration right in the desert. For this 3-day party, they'll build a real city with tents, bring 15,000 trees into the desert, and 50,000 songbirds. To keep the wine and champagne cool in the heat, helicopters would bring in blocks of ice the size of a van. The heads of 60 states would attend the celebration and be pleased, but the Iranian people themselves were not at all thrilled. In one interview, the Shah is asked whether such a party must surely be outrageously expensive and whether the money could have been spent on those very social needs. But the Shah calmly replies, "How do they know how much it costs?" American journalists later estimate the cost of the celebration at $100 million. Today, that would be over $600 million. What's annoying isn't the scale of the festivities themselves, but the fact that the celebration isn't for Iranians, it's just a show for foreigners. And the Shah's problem isn't that he's choosing some kind of misguided Western-style development, but that his regime simply mismanages the country, steals and ignores real problems and statistics. And when the economy was growing, the people were more or less satisfied. But when growth finally came to an end in the late 1970s, the pro-Islamic factions simply played skillfully on the sentiments of the discontented but poorly educated masses and sold them the idea of a traditional Islamic state where everyone would be well off. But it is precisely from this moment on that things in Iran get worse every year, and those very sanctions will begin to be imposed against it. And until February 22nd, 2022, Iran was the leader in the number of sanctions. There, one experiences all the perks of isolation. Instead of international payment systems, they have their own. Instead of the internet we're used to, they have their own versions of YouTube, Facebook, and Netflix. All foreign cars are sold at double the price. so the vast majority of people drive budget Iranian-made cars and use very cheap but terribly low-quality gasoline. It's clear that Iran has plenty of oil, but all high-tech industries are blocked. As a result, Tehran is constantly shrouded in smog. If anyone is tempted to write now that, look, those damned American imperialists are making life miserable for everyone who wants to free themselves from their rule, then consider this. The United States did not impose its first sanctions against Iran because of the Islamic Revolution, nor because Western businesses were being driven out of the country. They only imposed them after a mob of Iranian fanatics in Tehran stormed the U.S. embassy and took 66 American diplomats hostage there. Why? They demanded that the U.S. hand over the Shah, who had fled the country. He, by the way, would die in Egypt in 1980, and most of the hostages would be held until January 1981. The main economic outcome of Iran's transition from the Western model to its own Islamic one can be described in simple numbers. In 1978 to 1979, Iran produced 6 million barrels of oil per day. In 2015, less than 3 million. And today, Iran produces and sells 2 million barrels at best. Oil revenues are the main source of the country's budget, and just think, the demand for oil in the late 1970s and today, it's simply two different worlds. How much money could the country have earned and spent on its own development if it hadn't started acting hysterically and rashly? And things have reached the point where Iran simply has nowhere to get the money for its own rapid development. Of its 85 million inhabitants, 42 million are on welfare, and a third of the population lives below the poverty line. Iran would like to see the sanctions eased, but neither the United States nor the European Union is willing to do so, at least not until the regime changes. And Iran is clearly waiting for change. First, remember, I said it has an excellent geographical location. Well, indeed, Persia has always been a crossroads of trade routes. It has access to the Caspian Sea and, via the Persian Gulf, to the Indian Ocean. And second, the country is rich in resources. It has massive hydrocarbon reserves, plus a significant percentage of educated people. To give you an idea, according to statistics, 150,000 to 180,000 skilled professionals emigrate from the country every year. Why is this happening? Because thinking people need more than just money. The question is, what opportunities does the country offer as a whole? The opportunity to be killed if you wear your hijab incorrectly. The Iranian morality police beat and killed 22-year-old Iranian woman Mahsa Amini for wearing her hijab the wrong way. In response, women across Iran are symbolically cutting their hair and removing their hijabs, while men are taking to the streets to protest and demand a change in government because they realize that any one of them could be next. But no government is in any hurry to step down on its own because they're used to quelling protests using a tried and true formula. For example, the government tripled gasoline prices. People take to the streets. What's the response? The standard one. The government blames everything on foreign enemies and shuts down the internet for a few weeks. The protesters' organization and fervor wane. The authorities brutally suppress the uprising with bloodshed and killings, and the issue simmers until the next government blunder. Today's Iran has once again found itself at a critical historical juncture. Following the death of Ali Khamenei, power has passed to a new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei. Israel and the U.S. continue to strike Iranian military and nuclear facilities, fearing the country's growing strength and influence in the region. In response, Tehran acts not only directly but also through allied forces across the Middle East, drawing more and more neighboring states into the conflict. As a result, Iran finds itself going round in circles time and again. The government tries to keep the country under tight control, cracks down on protests, and blames internal problems on external enemies. In response, tensions are rising, both within society and around the country, where almost every conflict is somehow linked to Tehran. And so the history of Iran in recent decades looks like a series of attempts to preserve a system that is constantly forced to fight both its own society and the outside world at the same time. If you liked the video, don't forget to like and share it. See you in the future.